Hey, y'all. Welcome to the Liberation is Lit podcast, where the power of storytelling meets the force of social change. I'm your host, Taylor Simon, and in this podcast, we believe in the profound impact of stories. And today, I have the immense pleasure of being joined with author, actress, filmmaker, all of the things, creator, Catherine Joy White, which her book that we're going to talk about today. She talks about how she lives up to her name with joy, and the part I definitely feel that energy. So I want to extend a warm welcome to Catherine for being on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm so happy to be here to be talking with you and hopefully having this amazing conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Yes. So, kind of to kick us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey as a creator and storyteller?
Yes. I mean, you touched on it already. I mean, I'm Catherine Joy White, and I was blessed with that name by my mom. It's actually an interesting story. When I was a kid, I was kind of embarrassed of it, but somehow I didn't like the joy side of things. And I went by Cat, and I was kind of like, I'm Cat White, and I thought it was quite cool. And over the past, 5 years or so, I've kind of embraced that, like, not only because it's the name my mother gave me, she gave me that name for a reason, I'm her firstborn child, but also because it is me. And I think that's part of this whole coming of age and, I don't know, growth journey that I've been on. So, yeah, my work really is about, I guess, looking for hope and joy and celebration. And it's across mediums. I'm an actress, I'm a filmmaker, a screenwriter, director, but also author. I work in activism, so I'm working for the United Nations, organizations like the Premier League, more grassroots activism, mobilizing where I can. And I think I am always looking for exactly how we can change through positivity. I think there is enough talk of oppression. We know that exists, but I believe that the way that we can overcome and protect ourselves in the process is by looking around us and seeing what we have to celebrate and kind of amplifying and lifting all of those narratives with our work.
I love that so much. And that's kind of why I wanted to start Liberation is Lit because, yes, we definitely have the responsibility to learn about how oppression shows up, but also learning about how we can combat it with joy and the joy of storytelling and reading. So let's get into it about your book that's coming out, Threads of Gold. What inspired you to write it, and how did you decide or come across the stories of the Black woman mentioned in the book?
Yes. So this book has been on my heart and my mind and soul for, I guess, the best part of a decade now. And I always knew that I had this kind of idea to write this book that would sort of bring women together. It's not about looking at one woman, it's rather about how do we see how each woman has influenced the work of another and how that kind of, I guess, speaks to us today. But it actually, in kind of its, I guess, most concrete form, started life as my master's thesis, which I wrote in 2016, 2017. And it was about how Black women used food as a means of resistance. So I went from the Aunt Jemima figure who featured in the book to Beyonce's Lemonade, which had come out that year. And I was kind of tracing, from the end of the period of slavery to, 2016 world that we were in and seeing how food, broadly speaking, was useful as a means of empowerment and reclamation. Cut to a few years, and I kept working on this, and I was having all of these ideas and speaking to different people, and everyone kind of loved it, but didn't quite see, food, didn't quite understand where I was going. So I pitched something a bit different about, yeah, just something broader than just food, but how Black women throughout history and the present day have kind of paved the way, lifted themselves, lifted each other. So we had this kind of like idea that wasn't fully formed. And I kept thinking, what is this missing link, missing thread, I should say, but that feels like a pun. What's missing here? And over the time of kind of, I had all of these women already from my research and from what I'd already written for my master's and, everything I've read. Like, I'm like you, Taylor, I've been a bookworm since I was born. And I realized that the missing piece actually was, why am I the person writing this? I need to understand why I'm the person writing this here and now. And actually, once I had that thought and I started to think about, well, what do each of these women mean to me? And suddenly it became something very different. And that's how this metaphor of the tapestry was born, which is that, okay, we are all weaving it. And I've got the thread at this point and I'm weaving this tiny part of it. And I pass it on to someone else who picks it up and does the same. And we are the gold that's holding this together. And that unlocked something for me. And then from there, this book became like, I guess, not just, historical or academic or reporting. It became really deeply personal, which I guess I didn't expect when I set out to write it.
It's amazing how like everybody always talks about like how all of our collective struggles are always connected. But when you actually like do the work of examining, you realize how like even like somebody from the 1800s, like a Black woman, like how that connects to you today personally. And one thing I really loved about the book is that you write both from context of the UK and the US. So how do you think the experiences of the Black women in each country are linked and connected?
Do you know what? It's so funny. Like, I don't know if I should even say this. Obviously, I am British, but my biggest dream with this book was to publish it in the US. Like when I wrote it, everyone was like, "There are a lot of American women here," and I was kind of like, "Yes," because actually we have. This is so much of what has kind of influenced, through school at least, and kind of that side of things. We grew up hearing the stories of some of the more well known figures like Rosa Parks, but Rosa Parks led me to finding out more about Claudette Colvin, for example, and I think it's just America has obviously a very troubled history, but it also has an incredible history of pulling up, and pulling together and getting on and working and resistance and resilience in a different way, I think, than what I see in the UK. But I think what was really interesting is then can we put these figures side by side? Does that work? We do have really different, I guess, political histories, but ultimately, I think we're also going through this very similar journey, and goals of celebration and empowerment are universal. And I think that was also what was so profound writing it and kind of seeing how, I don't know, Diane Abbott, who's a British politician, can speak directly to Shirley Chisholm, or to Stacey Abrams. And I think that was really fascinating.
So you have an award-winning company, Cusini Productions, and you are also an actor. So what are some ways that storytelling in film have a certain power that books and literature may not have, and vice versa?
I think film's amazing because the visual medium is so powerful, right? And even if you take, I don't know, let's take a film like The Little Mermaid, which obviously came out last year and had this quite amazing impact, regardless of what you think of the film, because for the first time, all of these little black girls were seeing a mermaid, the lead in the film, a fantastical creature who, they've never seen themselves in that position before. And suddenly it opens up the possibilities. Well, if I can see, a mermaid who looks like me, I can go and I can do and I can be anything. And I think books do absolutely fulfill that role. I think for us, we're readers and we will lose ourselves and we will take our imaginations take us anywhere. But I guess not everyone's mind works in that way. And for some people, it's really about seeing something to believe it to be possible. So I think that also brings a great responsibility, right, in terms of the stories that we see represented on screen. And part of my kind of motivation in terms of founding my company was precisely that, because as an actor, you're always kind of at the mercy of how somebody else sees you. And of course, you want to work. So you keep doing, I'll play the best friend. I love acting, don't get me wrong. But I think I began to realize not only on a personal level, would this fulfill me, but also what does it mean for those who are coming behind me? And I always think about like 5-year-old me, 5-year-old girl. That's kind of always in the back of my mind. Like, what does she need to see, that 5-year-old who's coming up? So I think founding my company is similar to what you said in an interview I heard with you as well, where in terms of Liberation is Lit, you wanted to do this and know you were going to libraries and saying like, can I be in a librarian job? And no one was giving you that job. So you just thought, okay, I'm going to do it myself. And I loved hearing that. I thought it's so amazing how many of us have this in common as Black women. We maybe aren't being given the role, but we know what we want to do. And we know how we see the kind of net outcome of doing something like this, the greater good that we can bring about. So we just do it ourselves. And actually the film Countdown at Cassini was the first ever major motion picture made by a collective of Black women. And, they were fed up with the roles that Hollywood was giving them, and they were fed up with not being able to produce their own films. So they just got together, raised the money themselves, produced this film themselves, and did it. And I'm like, well, that's the name of my company there.
And I love that because it really like reminds me of that Shirley Chisholm quote of like, if like they don't offer you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And I've lately adopted the phrase, well, we're just gonna build our own table. So I love that. So I love how just like all of your work, even through like your book and like your work in film, all like ties in representation. And we talked about this a little bit, but how do you feel like representation in general kind of connect to the larger movement for liberation?
It's so important. There's that quote that's so overused, but I still love it. You can't be what you don't see. And I think, I mean, even in terms of, I don't know how much we can get into it, but what's going on globally right now. And I'm quite
Get
out.
into it. Get into it.
Okay,
This is the
thank you.
podcast to do it.
Thank you. So, in terms of the genocide of the Palestinian people that is happening right now in front of our eyes, and I'm very outspoken about this, and I use my social media platforms just to keep that conversation going. I do believe that if I keep sharing stuff and keep saying stuff, eventually someone might look at it and think about it and say, okay, maybe there's something I can do here. But I think that the problem with a lot of people is that they don't know what to do. I don't think people are evil. I think they don't know how and where to begin, and it feels really far away and it feels really overwhelming. So I think that's about representation in that instance, is kind of saying, okay, you might not be able to go out to Gaza right now, but you can boycott XYZ company because they are directly funding the arms movement. And I think it's not directly representation, but it's somehow about bridging the gap between where we want to be, the utopia that we know the world should be, and where we are right now, where we find ourselves stuck because, yeah, I guess the world kind of wants to make us feel helpless. So somehow by putting ourselves there and by making sure that we're seen and we're a part of that, we're going to pass that mantle on to other people to come through and do the same. I really do believe that.
I do as well. And that's why I think storytelling is really powerful in the activism and organizing movement. And for so long, I felt like storytelling was just, okay, this is a story about how oppression has affected me, but how can we use the power and generative power of storytelling to build and create the world we want to see when these systems that we're currently living in ultimately collapse? Because we as people created these systems, so we as people can create something else. And it's
Right.
just using our imagination to see what we want to create. And that kind of leads me to my next question of how do you feel like your work as a creator and storyteller overlap with your work as an activist?
I think I'm now finally getting to this place where I'm seeing and I'm able to, with my chest, say, look, this is who I am. And I've lately found a way of, because I do lots of different things, right? And often I'll say to people, I do this and this and this and this, and they sort of look at me with this like expression of horror. They're like, what? Like, how? Or you can't be really doing all of them to the full extent, or are you burnt out? Or, do you know what I mean? Everyone's always just got some opinion, normally negative. But lately I've worked out, okay, artist and activist, artivist, this is just what I say in my mind. I don't know if it works, but artivist. And the two directly impact the other. I really do believe in the power of art to change the world. And I think it's exactly what you just said. We can create the world that we want to exist in. We really can do that. And I mean, that is how things will change, I really think. And so, I don't know, one of my films, for example, I wrote after I lost someone close to me to suicide, and I started swimming in this lake near where I lived. And I, along the way, realized, like, oh, hang on, there's actually a whole thing here about Black people being in the water, and this is not a thing. And I was, suddenly finding myself having all of these conversations. But actually, that's the amazing thing about that film, which is commercially done amazing, like it's done brilliantly, but it's also kind of open up conversations around mental health and around Black people swimming and around the healing aspect of the water for all of us, not just for middle class, white women of us. I think there's also, I think that might be the way that I will always try and work, using art, but art that has a message that comes from the heart and that opens conversations.
I love that too because, like you said before, sometimes people just feel overwhelmed about like all the things that are happening in the world, and they don't use enough energy thinking about what they want to create. And that's why art is really important. And sometimes I feel like when I talk to artists, they're like an activist, like I just write poetry, and I feel like that's not enough. And it's something inside of me pushes back. Poetry can be an avenue of creativity, of creation, and like creating that world, and that is action. So, or at least the seed for action. And that's why I definitely believe in art and activism going together.
Yeah, you're planting a seed. That's what it is. Maybe it's not like the world isn't changed by someone reading that poem, but maybe they read that poem and the line stays with them and they think about, I saw that line about tents, the tents sort of crying. And I just thought, and I can't stop thinking about that. And I just read that. I scrolled through that poem on Instagram one morning, but I'm still thinking about that 4 or 5 days later, and who knows what that might spark someone to go on and do. And of course, so many of the women in this thread of gold were artists and creatives in some way. And I was looking at the book, I was like, okay, well, lots of artists here, but actually that is because they are activists, and activism is a thread that runs through all of that work. I think, especially with, lots of our foremothers, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, I think it had to be the case. I don't know what their art would have been if it wasn't that, because they had a voice that had to be heard, and that voice wasn't being listened to at that time. It still isn't necessarily now.
Right. And it reminds me of just thinking about, I saw this thing on Instagram the other day about how much creativity is stifled by poverty, and thinking about like our foremothers and how they had to make a way out of no way, and how even though it's not art in the traditional sense or like creativity in the traditional sense, there's a lot of creativity that is inherently tied to struggle, and how that translates into the activism that we see, that creation piece. So I've been thinking a lot about that lately too.
Absolutely. And I think it can also encourage all of us to broaden and expand our definition of how we see and what we define as art. So, for example, with the Maryse Condé book, Victoire, cooking was her creativity. She couldn't write, she couldn't speak French. She was living in a country where she was essentially muted, but she lifted her daughter out of poverty and into a better life by cooking and working for the families. And that was her art form, and it was creativity. And, Maryse Condé wrote so beautifully about it. Like, she was like a god when she was in the kitchen, and she does all these parallels between cooking and writing. And, that to me, that's one of the most profound and exciting things we could ever imagine. Art doesn't have to mean, because of course not everyone has the means to paint or perform or write. That is a luxury of time and financial stability that most of us do not have. But there are other ways of looking at that. And I think we should all be encouraged to expand our definition of what art is.
So, kind of speaking about books as art, what have you been reading lately?
I'm actually reading very old, it's practice, the very old journals of Alice Walker, because I love her so much. I'm so inspired by her. And again, that, when I was reading In Search of My Mother's Gardens, that was such a huge inspiration. And then I got this, it was my birthday last week, and I got like this huge book of like some of her old journals, which I just thought, and it's so fascinating. I never know how I feel about reading, I guess, someone's private correspondence, but it's been, agreed to be published. And it's so fascinating just kind of getting an insight into her mind and her way of thinking, and her, hates and desires and ambitions. And I'm kind of on a bit of a non-fiction journey at the minute. I was always fiction, fiction, fiction. I think lately I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm trying something else. I guess maybe since I've written a non-fiction book now, but there's something really wonderful about that. And when formats can kind of come together, so you suddenly see a poem in the midst of a journal, I really like that kind of melding of genre.
I do too. I have not read In Search of Our Mother's Gardens yet, but I have it on my bookshelf. Oh, and I will get to it one day.
Yes, and then we need to have another conversation when you read it.
Yes, definitely, definitely. So do you have any upcoming projects that you're working on that you want to share with us?
Yes, actually, very exciting. I have so the final chapter of this thread of gold, talking about kind of genres melding together or being quite different. I wrote it as, I guess it started as a letter, which I wrote now years ago, the morning after Roe v. Wade was overturned in America. And I started just putting pen to paper because I was really angry and I didn't know where to channel that. But then over the time of like working on the book and editing it, it became something different. It became, I suppose, more of a poem slash guidebook slash letter to the daughter I hope I one day will have, and what I wish for her, the life I wish she will have, the world I hope she will live in. And I have adapted that for screen. So I'm making it as an animation film. So it's going to be a little film. It'll be about 5 to 7 minutes long. And the incredible Gugu and Betharour is our narrator. So she's voicing the letter and working with an amazing company called Lupus Films, who have won an Emmy and loads of things. So it's going to be this incredible, really beautiful, working with thread as well. So the thread and the animation, and hopefully inspiring film that, you know, mothers, daughters, friends, dads, also everyone can watch and just kind of be transported. Yeah. So that I'm really excited about that.
I love that one so much. It reminded me of Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi.
Yeah. Good.
Her short little novel that was
She do be feminine?
no, it was a letter to her daughter.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah.
Mhm.
That actually, I need to reread that. Yeah, I forgot about that. I love that because I think she has a daughter already, if I'm right.
I think so. I think
Yeah.
so.
Oh, I love that.
Yes. So lastly, here, what advice do you want to offer listeners who want to make a positive impact in their community?
I think the best advice I can give is don't worry about finding the need to change the bigger thing. You know, start with the world around you. If you know that you want, I don't know, to achieve equality among, let's say, people of all genders, look around you. You know, what can you do in your backyard? What can you do in your community? And that way you won't feel overwhelmed. And then I also think with that, always give yourself grace and give yourself time to rest, because you are no good to anyone if you're burnt out, least of all yourself. And the most, you know, let's bring it back to Audre Lorde, but it's the most radical form of resistance. And I think that really is the kindest thing you can do to yourself and to the world. So yeah, think small and you will grow bigger. And always, always look after yourself. You are number one as well. Don't forget that.
Yes, because oftentimes we forget when we're fighting for liberation, we're also fighting for liberation for ourselves. And we need to extend some of that compassion and love to ourselves. Well, such a good time talking to you. Where to find you and your work?
You can find me. I'm most active on Instagram. So that's at Catherine Joy White. That's my name, is what I should say. At Catherine Joy White on Instagram. And you can also find me on my website, www.catwhite.co.uk. I'm on Twitter, but I don't use it all that much. And same with TikTok.
Thank you so much, Catherine Joy, for being with us on the podcast today. And just like sharing like your incredible like storytelling work. If you listeners have stories you want to share, want to suggest any topics, or just want to connect, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Although, like Catherine Joy, I'm not on TikTok that much. At Liberation is Lit. Or you can visit our website, liberationislit.com. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review. And remember, your voice matters. And together, through the lens of stories, we're going to make a difference in the world. Thanks, y'all.